Double stroke rolls, like any technique we perform on the snare drum, requires three fundamental things: a fulcrum, the engagement of the fingers, and the rotation of the wrists. Generally speaking, all weaknesses in technique can be attributed to a weakness in one or more of these main tenets. Either the fulcrum is not strong enough, the fingers are not engaging, or the wrist is not engaging or rotating sufficiently. Now, commonly, this is a weakness in the fulcrum. Slightly less commonly, this is the fingers not engaging, and then perhaps the one that is most often overlooked is to do with a lack of rotation in the wrist. In previous videos, I have discussed at great length the purposes of the fulcrum and the engagement of the the engagement of the fingers. So today I'm going to be looking at the rotation of the wrist and explore how this can be an attributing factor into a weak double stroke roll. The first thing I want to note is how all three of these elements must work together to create a strong double. In performing a double stroke, we start with the stick facing vertically from a formal perspective. The fulcrum is holding the stick steady at the front of the hand. This serves the purpose of holding the stick stationary relative to the rest of the grip. By this I mean the stick is not flapping around loosely in the hand, it is not rotating, it is not changing. A strong fulcrum keeps the stick in the same position in the hand regardless of what is being performed. If the fulcrum is in the correct position, the fingers can engage, by which I mean open and close, and you can see that stick traveling back and forwards in my hand without any wrist movement whatsoever. This provides us the fine control over the individual strokes. Finally, the wrist rotates from an upright position to a downwards position, which throws the stick towards the drum. So for the purposes of a double stroke roll, we start in an upwards position where the wrist is facing up and the fingers are open. As we throw the stick down towards the drum, like casting a fishing line or doing a smash in tennis, the fingers close as the wrist throws the stick downwards. Now, this obviously produces a stroke which wants to rebound upwards. Now, for this instance, rather than going up with the stick with our wrists, we're going to allow the fingers to open, which means they can then control and close again, producing the second stroke. You can see that second stroke was performed solely with the fingers, capturing the rebound from the first stroke and sending it back down again. Crucially, notice how the wrist stays downwards throughout this second stroke. It comes upwards for the first stroke, throws the stick downwards and stays down as the fingers open and close. So in essence, we get two strokes for one wrist movement. Let's explore this now as part of a sustained double stroke roll. And what I would like to focus on is how the wrists are following this sort of motion, whereas we're getting two strokes for every movement. Despite the speed of the double stroke roll there, the wrists are still moving relatively slowly. So we can start to think of this as the wrists playing a single stroke roll at half the speed of the double stroke roll we're actually performing. This is because, as I've said, with the use of the fingers opening and closing, we're getting two strokes of the stick for every rotation of the wrist. Now, the deficiency that I'm talking about here is the rotation of the wrist after the roll has started. Very commonly, I see this amongst my students. Once the roll has begun, the wrist rotation, most often in the weaker hand, stops, and all of the subsequent movement in the roll comes from the elbow, something like this. See, at that position, the wrist is almost locked, and the subsequent motions are coming from the elbow. Now, this is not inherently incorrect, but it is missing one of the fundamental aspects of the grip, which is the wrist rotation. So to avoid this, we want to make a conscious effort to draw out that upstroke at the beginning of every double. If I do that again, but this time consciously keep that weaker hand pointing upwards at the beginning of every double, you can see that the stick heights between the two strokes will even out. To bring out the articulation, the clean execution of every stroke, I'm making sure, especially with my weaker hand, to point upwards at the beginning of every stroke, making sure that wrist is rotating fully. Now, from this perspective, there is essentially no difference as far as the wrist is concerned between single strokes and double strokes. As I alluded to earlier, the wrist is essentially performing a single stroke roll at half the speed of the doubles. You can see there, as I transition between the single stroke roll and the double stroke roll, the wrists are essentially continuing the same motion. There is no inherent difference between the singles and the doubles as far as the wrists are concerned. So when I play at a slightly faster tempo, I need to make sure that those wrists are continuing that up-down rotation as I play the double strokes. And you can see there by a big, almost exaggerated rotation of the wrists playing the underlying single stroke roll, I get a much easier control of the stick using the fingers, which gives me bigger strokes, more articulation, and cleaner execution, which is ultimately what we're going for here. Now, in my experience, people generally fall at one end of the spectrum. On the one end, we have people that use just their wrists with no finger engagement, and at the other end, we have people that use just their fingers or the bounce with no wrist rotation. For the former, where the wrists do all the work, there is no essential rebound, so we're trying to get the wrists to do 2 rotations per stroke. You can hear how uneven that is and how hard I'm having to work because the wrists are trying to move in sequence with the double strokes, and this is such a limiting factor with regards to speed and execution. On the other hand, there is no wrist rotation. I'm playing much more from the elbows and it sounds much more like a closed roll, something like a weak buzz roll. And there is no rotation on the wrists at all, so we've not got that underlying single stroke roll that I was talking about. So we want to be smack bang in the middle where we've got a clean wrist rotation and a clean finger engagement to make sure we're getting the controlled, sustained double strokes. So a nice way to practice this is to transition between single strokes and double strokes. And I would suggest leading this with your weaker hand, which for me is my left hand, and trying to explore the motion of the wrists as the fingers switch between the single strokes and the double strokes. So if I do this quite slowly, I will notice, or we will notice, that the wrists, as I say, continue the same motion for the single strokes as they transition to the double strokes, and it's only the fingers that change. And what you are most likely to find, if this is an issue that is affecting you, is that as you transition into the double stroke roll, your elbow is doing more of the work and your wrist essentially locks. To draw out a cleaner, stronger double stroke roll, as I say, we want to focus more on that wrist rotation and let the wrists take over some of the larger momentum work, some of the larger rhythmic work, and let the fingers be in charge. So as I suggested right at the beginning, and as I have talked about in great length in other videos, we need a synergy between the fulcrum, the fingers, and the wrists, and this is a weakness in the wrist rotation that can often lead to an underdeveloped double stroke roll. Good technique really is about understanding. So I hope this video has shared a little bit of understanding with regards to the role of the wrists in these double strokes. Thank you very much for watching and good luck in your own practice. See you next time.